At just 13 years old, Joan of Arc began hearing voices she believed were from God. Those voices told her she was destined to save France. By 17, she led armies to impossible victories, and by 19, she was tied to a stake, engulfed in flames. What kind of life, what kind of pain does it take to live like this? Tonight, we'll slowly walk through her journey, from an unknown farmer's daughter to a tragic icon in history. Domremy, the village where Joan of Arc's story begins, was the kind of place where days looked the same year after year. Located in northeastern France, it was a small, sleepy collection of stone houses, fields, and families trying to scrape by. Life in the 15th century wasn't glamorous for anyone, but in Domremy, it was especially quiet, bordered by forests, meadows, and a sense of simple routine. For the people who lived there, most born and dying within the same handful of miles, the wider world felt more like a rumor, a distant abstraction made of wars they'd never see, or kings they'd only hear about in sermons. It was a life of farming, hard labor, and prayer, a life of survival. Joan wasn't any different from the other children who grew up in Domremy, at least at first. She was born around 1412 to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, a farming couple with some status as landowners, though not much beyond their village. Joan spent her childhood helping with chores, tending to crops, caring for animals, and fetching water from the local well. If you were to picture her, she'd likely be barefoot, her hair tucked under a modest coif, dressed in a simple tunic that had seen its share of wear and tear. Her days were long and rhythmic, guided by the church bells that marked the hours. Religious devotion wasn't just an option in Joan's world. It was the air they breathed. The village followed a steady calendar of church services, feast days, and prayers, and Joan's family, in particular, was known for being devout. But imagine how drastically life can change when, in the middle of this predictable, earthbound existence, something utterly unexplainable happens. For Joan, it began one ordinary day while walking in her family's fields. She later described it as hearing a voice, suddenly and without warning. It wasn't just a voice, though. It was accompanied by a light, a bright, ethereal glow she couldn't explain. At first, Joan wasn't sure what to make of it. Fear was her immediate response, and she ran home, shaken yet unable to describe what she had experienced in a way that would make sense to anyone else. To her, though, it seemed clear that this was no ordinary event, and over time, the voices revealed themselves. She believed they belonged to none other than Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, holy figures who told her she had a purpose far beyond what her quiet life in Domremy had prepared her for. It's hard to grasp what this must have felt like for a 13-year-old girl. She lived in a world where the church was the ultimate authority, the guiding force not only for morality, but for understanding reality itself. Yet, while faith was a way of life, hearing voices wasn't simply celebrated. If someone claimed to have visions, the community didn't jump to label them a saint. More often, they were considered mad, delusional, or possibly worse, heretical. Joan likely would have understood this, even as a child. She knew enough about her world to realize that these experiences might not be met with understanding or encouragement. And still, the voices didn't stop. Over time, they became clearer, more directive. They told her she was chosen to do what no one had ever done, to drive the English out of France and restore the rightful King Charles to his throne. Joan's life up to this point had been steeped in ordinary struggles, planting, harvesting, kneeling in prayer. But now, there was this new element, a voice in her head and a feeling in her heart, pulling her towards something greater. It's worth noting that Joan's visions weren't entirely unimaginable for someone in her shoes. The medieval Catholic world was deeply mystical, and many people believed in miracles, signs from God, and interventions by saints. Yet there was also fear, a sharp suspicion of anything that stepped outside the careful lines of orthodoxy. A claim like Joan's could bring awe, but it could just as easily bring condemnation. Think about her daily life during this time, the stark contrast between what the voices were saying and the labor-heavy reality around her. One moment, she'd be milking a cow or fastening a cart to a mule, and the next, she'd be reeling from yet another cryptic message about her divine destiny. Religious practices likely helped her process some of these experiences. Joan's family attended church regularly, and she would have been familiar with tales of saints who suffered and sacrificed themselves for their faith. But even so, nothing in her upbringing could have fully prepared her for this. Hearing that you're called to save a nation at such a young age, that's not normal, not for anyone. And yet, Joan didn't dismiss it. Not entirely. It wasn't as though she immediately burst into action either. Instead, she lingered in a state of uncertainty, wondering why, of all people, these voices had chosen her. Think about it. Joan was a girl, a peasant, uneducated, probably illiterate. This wasn't an era where girls were encouraged to lead anything, let alone armies. The instructions she was receiving must have felt impossible, even absurd. For a long time, she simply kept them to herself, silent and contemplative, as her family and neighbors went about their daily routines, none of them knowing the weight sitting on Joan's mind. But the voices didn't leave her alone. It wasn't just that they kept coming. They started becoming more urgent, more precise. By the time she was in her mid-teens, they had laid out a clear path for her. Go to the Dauphin, the Crown Prince of France, and tell him she was the one who would lead his cause to victory. This wasn't just a suggestion. For Joan, it felt like a command she couldn't ignore. And as much as she may have wanted to cling to her quiet life, that life was already fading, slipping away under the weight of something much larger than herself. By now you might be wondering, how could this teenage girl carry this burden all on her own? Did she ever confide in anyone? Did anyone believe her? The truth is, Joan's claims were met with confusion and, very often, rejection. But that's a story for the next chapter, when her private revelations start to collide with the public world of her family, her neighbors, and a skeptical church. For now, know this: those voices wouldn't just shape her life. They would drive her to change the fate of an entire country. Imagine having something so profound burning within you, something you knew was real, and yet everyone around you said you were wrong, or crazy, or worse, sinful. For Joan of Arc, this was her reality. When she finally spoke about the voices that had been commanding her for years, she didn't find the understanding or support she might have hoped for. Instead, she was met with doubt, worry, and in some cases, outright fear. Her parents were the first hurdle. Jacques, her father, was a practical man, grounded in the struggles of daily life. He'd labored hard to provide for his family, and he likely imagined Joan following the expected path for a daughter, helping in the fields or around the house until she married a local boy and settled into a similar life. He certainly didn't expect his youngest to announce that she had been chosen by saints to save France. To him, this talk wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. At best, it could bring shame to the family. At worst, It could bring scrutiny from the church or other authorities. Superstition and religion in the 15th century were tightly woven together, and claiming to hear the voice of God wasn't taken lightly. It often brought more suspicion than awe. Joan's mother, Isabel, seemed to have been slightly more understanding, though that's not to say she was entirely at ease. It said Isabel was deeply devout herself, relying heavily on prayer and religious rituals to guide her days. But even for someone like her, Joan's visions were far outside the realm of what one could easily accept. Perhaps she wanted to believe her daughter, wanted to trust that these messages were truly divine, but it's easy to picture her conflicted. A mother torn between wanting to protect her child and fearing what dangers such claims could bring. As for the rest of the village, it's hard to say exactly how Joan's neighbors reacted, but you can imagine the gossip. A small community like Domremy didn't have much in the way of secrets. Word must have traveled fast. First a whisper at the well, then a murmured conversation after Sunday Mass. Some likely dismissed her as an imaginative girl who had let her faith run wild. Others, more fearful or fraught with superstition, might have seen her as a risk, someone meddling with forces that shouldn't be tampered with. Accusations of witchcraft, while not as common as we sometimes imagine, were always a lurking threat in medieval Europe for anyone who stepped too far out of the norm. And so, Joan, a girl already carrying the weight of divine voices, now bore the additional burden of isolation. She must have felt caught between two worlds, the earthly one that couldn't comprehend her calling, and the spiritual one urging her to act. Imagine what it was like for her, moving through her daily routines, trying to fit into a life that suddenly felt so separate from where she was being called. At the village market or the family's fields, there was a world of expectation that she would grow up, marry, and play her part in the simple rhythm of Domremy life. Yet as she churned butter or mended garments, the voices reminded her that her path lay far from these hills. In the medieval Catholic mindset, divine intervention wasn't unheard of. Tales of saints and martyrs were woven into everyday life, shared through sermons and stained glass windows. Yet, those stories came with a kind of distant, reverent detachment. They didn't live next door. They didn't walk among you, wearing patched clothes and carrying a basket of eggs. For Joan's family and neighbors, the idea that someone so ordinary could be called by saints, it challenged every assumption they held about their world. It's important to understand that this skepticism wasn't just born of disbelief. It was also a product of fear. Claims like Joan's were a risk, threatening to draw unwanted attention from both religious authorities and the volatile political climate of the time. At this point in history, France was deep in the throes of the 100 Years' War, a drawn-out and bitter conflict with England. The country was fractured, its monarchy weak, and its lands often overrun with soldiers who cared more for pillaging than for loyalty. In this climate, stepping out of line, even for religious reasons, could quickly mark you as trouble. For Joan's father, Jacques, it wasn't only the church he feared. According to some accounts, he worried someone might accuse Joan of being possessed or of practicing witchcraft. He went so far as to say he would rather see her drown than let her bring shame or danger to their family through such claims. Whether these words were said in anger or with real intent is unclear, but either way, they underscore how deeply unsettling her visions must have seemed to those closest to her. Despite the criticism and doubt, Joan's belief in her calling didn't waver. She kept pushing, determined to convince anyone, that her voices were genuine and her purpose real. It wasn't an easy road. Isolation has a way of wearing a person down, especially a young girl with no formal education and little power to act on her own. Yet, something in her refused to relent. Maybe it was her faith, so deeply ingrained in her daily life. Or maybe it was something else, a kind of singular determination that allowed her to stand firm despite every reason to give up. And slowly, Joan began to look beyond her small village for answers. If her family and neighbors wouldn't listen, perhaps others might. Perhaps there was someone who could validate what she was saying, someone with the authority to recognize her calling. This is where we catch the first glimpse of Joan's remarkable courage, a willingness to step outside the only world she had ever known to follow a path no one else believed in. Her voices had told her to help the Dauphin, the uncrowned King of France, and Joan was determined to do just that. It's hard to imagine the leap this must have felt like for her, not just in a figurative sense, but in an actual, practical way. Joan didn't grow up in a time where a young girl could freely travel or make bold declarations without consequence. The medieval world was rigidly hierarchical, and stepping out of place could land you in serious trouble. Yet she was preparing to do something unimaginable. Leave her family, her home, and any semblance of normalcy, all to convince powerful men that she, a peasant girl with no political or military experience, had heard the word of God. This wasn't just bold, it was nearly unthinkable. And yet, Joan made that decision anyway. Little by little, she started to share her plans, speaking to others outside her immediate family about the visions that had been guiding her for years. Some dismissed her outright, unable to even entertain such an idea. Others, surprisingly, seemed intrigued, perhaps not fully convinced, but curious enough to listen. What's striking about Joan's persistence is that it wasn't fueled by arrogance or a sense of self-importance. She didn't declare herself a hero or seek attention for her own sake. All her actions, all her choices, were rooted in her deep belief that this wasn't about her at all. It was about something far bigger, her mission, her voices, her God. When she spoke of her calling, it wasn't with a childlike naivety, but with a simple and unwavering conviction. Eventually, that conviction led her to take the step that would change her life forever, leaving Dom Remy behind to seek out Charles, the Dauphin of France. She believed he would listen. She believed he would see what no one else could, what even her own family couldn't. It was a terrifying move, one laden with risk and uncertainty. But for Joan, it was also the only move left. The voices had commanded her, and now nothing. Not isolation, not skepticism, not fear could hold her back. Her decision to leave was as much an act of faith as it was an act of defiance. It meant walking away from the narrow expectations laid out by her family, her village, and her time. It meant stepping into a world that, for all she knew, might reject her entirely. But as we'll see, Joan wasn't just stepping into the unknown. She was stepping toward a destiny that even she couldn't fully understand. How exactly did a penniless peasant girl convince one of the most powerful men in France to hear her out? That's where her story truly begins to stretch the boundaries of the imaginable. How does a teenage peasant girl, someone with no wealth, no noble connections, not even a proper last name, walk into the court of the future King of France and get him to listen to her? If it sounds impossible, that's because, by every measure of medieval society, it was. But Joan of Arc did it, and not just because of sheer determination. The timing of her arrival couldn't have been more desperate for France, a country broken in half by war and teetering on collapse. The year was 1429, and France was deep in the 100 Years' War. a long and exhausting conflict with England that had stretched on for almost a century. The French monarchy was in chaos. The reigning king, Charles VI, had died years earlier, but not before dealing his country a devastating blow. Struggling with mental illness for much of his reign, Charles VI signed the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which disinherited his own son Charles, the man Joan would later fight for, and named the English king's heir as the next ruler of France. When Charles VI died, the English crowed about their victory, claiming the throne for the infant King Henry VI. Meanwhile, Charles, the disinherited son, still clung to his claim under what little support he had left. You had two sides fighting to rule the same country, and neither had much to offer the people except chaos and destruction. Charles, known at this stage as the Dauphin, wasn't exactly commanding respect. His nickname in history, the well-served, didn't come from his ability to lead, but from the loyalty of his advisors, which is fairly revealing. He had yet to be crowned, and a large chunk of France's northern territories, including its capital, Paris, was under English and Burgundian control. To make matters worse, the city of Orléans, which had been holding the line against English forces, was under siege. If Orléans fell, everything south of the Loire River, including Charles's tenuous court, would be open to invasion. The French countryside was already splintered by war, its people starving and exhausted from decades of conflict. If anyone needed a miracle, it was Charles. Enter Joan. At just 17 years old, she announced her plan to travel straight to Charles and deliver a message from God. It wasn't entirely straightforward, of course. First, she had to convince others to help her get there. In Vaucouleurs, a nearby town, she sought out a local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, and told him flat out that she was sent to save France. His reaction? Laughter. It's one thing to be a soldier and deliver some grand speech about loyalty to the crown. It's another for a teenage girl in a wool dress with a thick provincial accent to declare herself a savior chosen by heaven. Robert dismissed her, but Joan refused to leave. She returned again and again, insisting she had been sent by God and pleading for him to hear her out. When her persistence didn't work, she added something else, a prophecy. She told Robert that the siege of Orléans would break, and it would only happen if she was allowed to help. What's striking here is how Joan turned the tools of the time, faith, prophecy, and religious conviction, into something powerful. This was a period when religion wasn't just a personal belief system, but the central framework for society. Armies carried banners bearing the Virgin Mary into battle. Kings were crowned under the authority of the Church. To claim divine backing wasn't just bold. It was the one thing no man, no matter how powerful, could easily dismiss outright. Add to this the fact that Joan seemed to have an almost intimidating certainty. Even at this stage, people commented on her confidence and clarity. This wasn't a frightened girl looking for guidance. She spoke like someone who already knew how the story would end. Eventually, Robert relented. Or maybe he didn't want to deal with her anymore. Either way, he provided her a horse and a small escort to travel to Chinon, where Charles was holding court. This journey alone would have been terrifying. The roads were dangerous, especially for a young girl, even with a few bodyguards in tow. You had bandits, hostile soldiers, and the ever-present threat of capture. But Joan made it, arriving in Chinon after traveling nearly 300 miles over rough terrain. It was the first major step in her mission, but her challenge was far from over. When Joan requested an audience with Charles, she wasn't exactly welcomed in with open arms. The court was divided. Some saw her as a harmless oddity. Others saw her as dangerous, either delusional or potentially even touched by evil forces. Religion was a double-edged sword in medieval politics. Yes, people believed in divine intervention, but they also believed in the devil's ability to deceive. For every whisper that Joan might have been sent by God, there was another whisper suggesting she might be a witch or worse. Charles himself wasn't an especially brave or decisive figure. By all accounts, he was indecisive, hesitant, and often ruled more by his advisors than by his own convictions. Still, something about Joan piqued his interest. Maybe it was desperation. After all, what did he really have to lose? When Joan appeared before him for the first time, the story goes that she wasn't fooled by the game the Dauphin played. On Charles's orders, a member of his court had dressed as the king, while Charles himself wore plainer clothes and blended into the crowd. Without hesitation, Joan walked past the fake king and bowed directly to Charles, identifying him as the true Dauphin. This moment was key. For one, it demonstrated Joan's confidence, the quiet certainty that would define her interactions at court. For another, it played directly into the mindset of the age. Charles and his court were grappling with both political and spiritual uncertainty. If Joan could identify him without any help, it lent credibility to her claims of divine insight. But Joan didn't stop there. She also revealed private details about Charles, things she couldn't have known unless, as she insisted, the saints had told her. Accounts differ on how much she supposedly told him, but whatever it was, it had a profound effect on Charles. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Charles's advisors were deeply skeptical. This was a time of trickery and political games, and another prominent possibility on their minds was that Joan might be an English spy. To test her claims more rigorously, Charles arranged for a group of theologians to examine her. They grilled her about her visions, her theology, and her intentions. She answered all their questions with unshakable composure and, more importantly, without offering any inconsistencies. One chronicler even noted that her childlike humility disarmed some of her interrogators. But Joan also had one more ace up her sleeve: prophecy. In Joan's time, prophecies about France weren't just superstition. They were a part of the national psyche. There was one prophecy in particular that people were whispering about before Joan even arrived: that France would be saved by a virgin from the region of Lorraine. Joan, as a young woman from that area, fit the description perfectly. Whether this prophecy was widely circulated or simply attached to her retroactively is hard to say. Regardless, it gave Joan a powerful advantage in convincing those around her. The combined effect of Joan's unwavering faith, her self-possession, and the weight of these prophetic ideas worked. Against all odds, Charles agreed to let her lead a military effort to break the siege of Orléans. At first, it wasn't exactly an overwhelming vote of confidence. The army Joan was handed was small, hardly the kind of force to change the tides of a war. But the fact it was granted to her at all, that shocked everyone. Here was a 17-year-old girl, untrained in combat, suddenly given authority in a world where even seasoned knights had to claw for recognition. You can almost feel the tension in that moment. For Joan, it was a step closer to fulfilling her divine mission. For her enemies, it was the unpredictable chaos that would soon send shockwaves through the battlefield. But for the soldiers under her command, many of whom were hardened veterans or mercenaries, seeing her take charge must have been its own battle. How do you trust someone so young, so inexperienced? And how on earth could she lead them to victory? This is where Joan's journey truly takes a turn. The battlefields weren't just a test of strategy or endurance. They became the ultimate test of her faith. And, as you'll see, it was a test she faced with a kind of resolve no one could ignore. Imagine putting on armor for the first time, not as a costume or some playful dare, but with the knowledge that you're about to lead men into battle. Men who don't trust you, men who don't think you belong, men who have spent their lives training for the violence ahead of them, and you, a teenage girl, are supposed to tell them what to do. That's exactly what Joan of Arc faced when she stepped into not just the role of a soldier, but a leader, commanding an army for the first time. And it wasn't just the weight of combat pressing on her shoulders. It was an entire country's hope, fragile as glass, hanging on whether she could turn the tide of a war that had already dragged on for nearly a century. Joan's transformation from peasant to military leader didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast. After convincing Charles to allow her to lead an army to break the siege at Orléans, the first challenge was simply appearing the part. She was outfitted in armor, plate, chainmail, the whole works, the kind of gear usually reserved for knights or commanders, people with names and titles. Joan had neither. The sight of her must have been striking. A girl who just months earlier was trudging through the mud in linen skirts was now astride a horse with a sword at her hip. Her banner, a symbolic beacon to rally troops in medieval warfare, depicted the figures of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and angels, framed by the words, Jesus Maria. For someone so young and untrained, Joan carried herself with surprising composure. But wearing armor and carrying a banner didn't magically silence the doubt swirling around her. The men she was supposed to lead weren't exactly thrilled to take orders from her. Some openly questioned why a teenage girl with no military experience was being allowed to command. Can you blame them? They weren't just risking their pride or reputations by following her. They were risking their lives. Many grumbled about Charles's decision to listen to what they saw as superstition, an act of desperation by a weak dauphin, clinging to any hope he could find. High-ranking commanders viewed Joan as more of a nuisance than an asset, and even among the soldiers, respect wasn't freely given. Joan had to prove herself worthy, and her first test didn't wait long. In April 1429, Joan and her troops advanced toward Orléans, a city that had endured months under siege by the English. Supplies were dwindling, morale was low, and the defenders were close to the breaking point. The English had built siege fortifications around the city, tightening their grip and cutting off reinforcements. Breaking through that kind of strategic chokehold wasn't just hard, it was seen as nearly impossible, especially given France's recent streak of military blunders. Yet Joan didn't come to Orléans with caution or calculated self-doubt. She came with unshakable confidence, not in herself, but in the divine mission she believed she was carrying out. From the beginning, Joan's approach stood out. Unlike conventional commanders, she didn't rely on experience because, well, she didn't have any. Instead, she leaned into her faith. She began her campaign by calling on her troops to confess their sins and attend Mass. To Joan, this wasn't just a religious gesture. It was a crucial step in preparing them for God's favor. Strangely enough, it worked. Her fervent belief stirred something in the men. Curiosity, if not yet loyalty. Over time, what began as skepticism started to shift. She wasn't like the other leaders they'd seen before. She believed with absolute clarity that they would win. And sometimes that sheer conviction was enough to inspire people to fight harder. The first clashes at Orléans weren't immediate triumphs. Joan had to contend with both the English forces and the doubts of her own commanders, who hesitated to follow her plans fully. When Joan ordered her troops to strike at the enemy's fortifications, some of the captains stalled, overriding her commands. For days, this tension simmered, but eventually, Joan had her way. She led assaults on key strongholds surrounding the city, not from the back lines, but right in the thick of things. Accounts from the time describe her fearlessness in battle. More than once, Joan was seen raising her banner to lead charges or rally men under fire. She was everything the men didn't expect. Young, inexperienced, yes, but also brave to a fault. During one attack, she was struck by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. While most people her age, or let's face it, most people of any age, would have collapsed and called it quits, Joan pushed on. She ordered the arrow removed and went straight back into the fight. The turning point came during a decisive assault on the English fortifications. Stalemates don't make for rousing stories, but this one didn't last. Joan's troops broke through, forcing the English to retreat from their positions and eventually abandon the siege altogether. Orléans was saved. For the first time in years, a French army had managed to deliver a significant victory, and Joan was at the center of it. Now you might wonder, how much of this victory was actually Joan's doing? After all, she wasn't a trained strategist. But warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of tactics. It was also psychological. Morale played a huge role in determining the outcome of battles, and Joan's impact on morale was undeniable. The men under her command, once skeptical and grumbling, began to see her as more than a curious figurehead. To them, she became a living symbol of hope. Think about how powerful that must have been. After years of crushing losses, here was someone who didn't just promise victory but delivered it. Meanwhile, the English were left scrambling to explain how they had been beaten. And their explanation? Witchcraft. Some English accounts describe Joan as a sorceress, claiming her victories could only be the result of dark magic. It was easier for them to accept that than to admit they had been outmatched by a girl who believed God was on her side. But no matter how much scorn they poured on her, it couldn't undo what had just happened. The French saw Joan as a miracle worker, a divine messenger sent to turn their fortunes around. Her victories at Orléans weren't just military achievements. They were fuel for the larger political struggle. They bolstered the authority of Charles, giving him the momentum he needed to push further toward becoming king. Over the next few weeks, Joan led her forces into more battles, securing key towns and fortresses that had been under English or Burgundian control. Each success seemed to deepen the myth surrounding her. The same men who had doubted her had begun to rally behind her leadership. They trusted her, not because she was an experienced commander, but because she inspired them in ways no one else could. But with success came danger. Joan's growing fame didn't sit well with everyone, least of all her enemies. The English weren't just embarrassed, they were furious. To them, Joan became a target, not just as an obstacle in battle, but as a political and religious threat. Even within her own ranks, there were those who resented her success, jealous of the spotlight she had stolen. Some French nobles likely saw her as a useful tool, but one they could dispose of when she outlived her purpose. For now, though, the victories kept coming, and they gave France something it hadn't had in years: belief. Not just belief in Joan or Charles or any individual figure, but belief that the tides of war could actually turn. Joan had taken a fractured, demoralized country and given its people a reason to hope. She had proved, at least for the moment, that faith, whether divine or simply the faith of soldiers in their leader, could change the course of history. But even as her legend grew, so did the forces working against her. Enemies weren't just lurking on the battlefield. They were in the courts, in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Joan's victories didn't make her invincible. They made her vulnerable too, and as the pressure mounted, it wouldn't be long before the forces circling her closed in. Despite all she had gained, there was a harsh truth she would soon have to face. Victories could be fleeting, and for everything she inspired, there were those who wanted nothing more than to silence her for good. Joan's rise to fame had been meteoric, but with fame came enemies, and not just among the English, who openly cursed her name. Back home, in her own country, among the people she had fought for, her growing influence started to make certain powerful men uneasy. It wasn't just her military success or the miraculous nature of her victories at Orléans and beyond. It was the way the people looked at her, the way soldiers rallied behind her banner with a kind of loyalty and fervor they didn't show their lords. To many, Joan was no longer just a teenage girl in armor. She was a symbol, and symbols have power, sometimes too much power for others' comfort. By the time Joan arrived at the city of Compiègne in 1430, the situation in France had grown even more complicated. While the war against the English waged on, internal divisions were breaking apart the fragile alliances holding the country together. Chief among these divisions was the growing hostility between the factions loyal to King Charles VII, Joan's Dauphin, now crowned, and the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, which had allied itself with the English. Burgundy's loyalties weren't about national pride or deep-seated hatred of France. They were about territory, influence, and whatever served their interests at the time. For Joan, this division wasn't just a political inconvenience, it was a direct threat. Compiègne, a walled city, strategically important for controlling northern France, had been under pressure from Burgundian forces for weeks. Joan, still seen by many as the symbolic heart of the French resistance, led a small force to bolster the city's defense. And at first, it looked like she might pull off another miracle. Her presence invigorated the defenders, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the siege might fail. But not all of Joan's stories ended in triumph. This time, her enemies were watching carefully, looking for their chance to strike, and when it came, they didn't hesitate. On May 23rd, 1430, Joan led a small group of soldiers out of Compiègne to confront the Burgundians. It was a bold move, maybe even reckless, but Joan didn't do cautious. Her plan was to strike hard and retreat strategically back behind the safety of the city walls. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The Burgundians counterattacked, forcing Joan and her forces to retreat back toward the gates. In the chaos, Joan found herself caught in the crush of retreating soldiers, surrounded by Burgundians closing in fast. The city gates, instead of staying open for a last-minute rescue, slammed shut. Defenders inside the city, fearing an enemy breach, had decided to save the city, not the soldiers, not Joan. Pinned between the closing gates and advancing enemies, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by the Burgundian forces. It must have been a gutting moment for her, this girl who had so often turned impossible odds into miraculous victories. To be dragged from her horse, physically captured, and rendered silent, at least in action, was the starkest reversal of fortune. And it wasn't just devastating for Joan. News of her capture soon spread, and with it came a ripple of fear and disbelief throughout France. The immediate consequences were grim. Joan wasn't treated as a prisoner of war in the way a noble commander might be. She was a prize, an invaluable one. For the Burgundians, her capture wasn't just a military victory, it was a golden opportunity. They knew exactly what she represented, and exactly how much the English would pay to get their hands on her. And so began the next chapter of Joan's life, in which her fate would be decided not on the battlefield, but in negotiation rooms and, ultimately, a courtroom rigged against her. To understand Joan's capture, you have to understand the motivations swirling around her captors. The Burgundians didn't care about her divine mission or her visions of saints. To them, Joan was a problem solver of the political variety, one that came with a price tag. They knew the English viewed her as a critical threat, not just militarily, but ideologically. For years, Joan had been the figurehead of French resistance, a rallying cry for troops and a symbol of hope for a shattered nation. If they could hand her over to the English, they would deal France a psychological blow and, at the same time, solidify their alliance with their powerful neighbours across the Channel. Selling Joan to the English wasn't just about strategy, though. This was personal. To the English, Joan was more than just a girl in armour. She was an insult. For nearly a century, they had fought to legitimise their claim to French lands, and suddenly, here was this peasant girl, storming battlefields with divine conviction, claiming not only that the English were wrong, but that God himself was on her side. To an army of highly educated and deeply superstitious knights, Joan wasn't just an enemy. She was an affront to the very idea of English rule. That's a kind of anger that doesn't go away. So when the Burgundians handed Joan over, the English were ready to make her pay for every battle, every humiliation, every challenge to their power. Joan would spend months in captivity, first held by the Burgundians and later by the English, her freedom auctioned off like it was simply a business deal. During this time, no effort was made to rescue her, and this is where things get complicated. King Charles VII, the man she had fought for, the man she had helped crown, didn't take any significant action to secure her release. Why? It's hard to say for sure. Maybe he believed her capture was a test of her divine protection and that God would intervene. Maybe his advisors convinced him she had already served her purpose, and spending resources to save her wasn't worth it. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, Charles understood that Joan's growing influence was as dangerous to him as it was to his enemies. Whatever the reason, the French court's silence in this crucial moment was deafening. Joan, once the most celebrated figure in France, was left to face her enemies alone. And her enemies made their intentions clear from the start. This wasn't going to be a fair detainment or an honourable imprisonment. The English weren't interested in keeping Joan as a prisoner of war. They were determined to destroy her, to obliterate her reputation and her influence by turning her from a saint into a heretic. Plans for her trial began almost immediately, a calculated attempt to dismantle the legend of Joan of Arc piece by piece. It's worth noting that trials for heresy in the 15th century weren't exactly known for their fairness. The Church, which was supposed to be a neutral arbiter in such cases, was far from impartial here. The English had connections within the Church, and they leaned on them heavily to stack the odds in their favour. The goal of Joan's trial wasn't to uncover the truth. It was to condemn her publicly, to strip away the divine aura she carried and cast her as a dangerous fraud. From the moment the charges started taking shape, it was clear that Joan wasn't walking into a court. She was walking into a trap. Joan's capture was the moment her story shifted. when the battlefield battles she could charge into with her banner raised turned into courtroom battles, fought with words instead of swords. But no speech, no argument, no miracle was going to change the outcome of what was to come. Her trial wasn't about finding justice. It was a weapon, a slow and deliberate dagger meant to end the Joan of Arc myth once and for all. Or so her enemies thought. The days of leading armies were over. Now Joan would have to defend herself, her faith, and her very identity in front of men who had already decided she didn't belong. While Joan had won battles with courage and conviction, this new fight was something far more insidious. It wasn't about strength or strategy. It was about surviving when survival seemed impossible. Because for all the physical pain and hardship she'd faced before, nothing quite matched what awaited her in the months ahead. A rigged trial where justice wasn't blind, but staring straight at her, dagger in hand. Imagine walking into a room where every face is set against you, every question is a trap, and the people holding your fate have already decided what it will be. That's what Joan of Arc faced during her trial for heresy in 1431. It wasn't a courtroom, as we'd imagine one today. No impartial judge, no chance to argue her case fairly. This was a performance, carefully choreographed by the English and their allies. But it wasn't a show for Joan's benefit. In fact, it was hardly for her at all. This trial wasn't about justice. It was about destruction. Specifically, the destruction of Joan's image as a hero, a symbol, and a threat. Joan's trial took place in Rouen, Normandy, a city deep in English-occupied territory. That choice wasn't accidental. The English wanted total control over the process, far away from areas still loyal to France where Joan's name might stir up unrest. From the start, they worked closely with the church to make her trial appear legitimate, while ensuring it remained anything but. On paper, this was an ecclesiastical trial, a matter of the church, not politics, but you don't have to look very hard to see the English fingerprints all over it. They knew killing Joan outright could turn her into a martyr, so the goal was simpler: destroy her reputation. If they could prove she wasn't divinely guided, but instead a heretic or a witch, her victories would be discredited, and, they hoped, her legacy would dissolve. For months, Joan had already languished in captivity. She was kept under harsh conditions, often chained in a cold, damp cell, and always guarded by English soldiers, not nuns or priests, as would have been typical for a woman in a church trial. From the moment she was captured, Joan had been denied the basic respect her status as a prisoner of war and as a human being should have guaranteed. But physical hardship wasn't the main focus of her captors. No, what they wanted was her mind, her words, the pieces of herself they could use against her, and they had every intention of forcing those pieces out. The interrogations started immediately. Day after day, Joan faced panels of learned men, priests, theologians, bishops, all of them older, all of them educated, all of them wielding their authority to box her in. These weren't straightforward questions. The trial records reveal how deliberately these men crafted their words, laying traps inside traps, hoping Joan would slip. They'd demand she explain her visions, justify her actions, and define specific points of theology, all designed to cross her up. At one point, they asked her if she believed she was in God's grace, a question so loaded it was practically a minefield. Answer yes, and she'd be accused of arrogance, claiming to know God's will. Answer no, and they'd twist it as evidence that she doubted her divine calling. Joan's response? Simple and sharp. If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there. It left them nowhere to go. This was Joan's strength and her curse. She didn't back down. Every time they pressed her, she answered with the same calm conviction that had carried her through battles. She didn't flinch, didn't hedge her words, didn't betray a flicker of doubt. When they questioned her about the voices she claimed to hear, St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, Joan didn't waver. She described their presence in vivid detail, speaking of their guidance and their urging for her to save France. To her inquisitors, this wasn't divine testimony. It was fodder for accusations. They questioned why saints would speak to a peasant girl instead of someone of higher standing. They tried to trap her into contradictions, to get her to admit the voices were a figment of her imagination or worse, messages from the devil. Sticking to her story wasn't just bold, it was an extraordinary mental effort. Every word she said was scrutinized, dissected, and twisted, yet she refused to let them distort her core belief that she had acted on God's command. But the trial wasn't just about her faith. Her enemies wanted to attack every piece of her identity. As part of their charges, they focused on something as seemingly mundane as her clothing. Joan had always worn men's clothing while leading the army, practical, protective, and symbolic in its rejection of traditional gender roles. To the church authorities, this was deeply offensive. Women wearing men's clothes went against the strict social norms of the time and, crucially, against certain interpretations of biblical law. Her accusers harped on this point mercilessly, claiming it was clear proof of her unnatural defiance and her proclivity to sin. Joan defended herself with startling pragmatism. She explained that wearing men's clothing in battle wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. Armor made for men offered protection, a dress simply wouldn't. Even while imprisoned, she continued to wear men's clothing for modesty and safety, as the guards watching over her were men. To modern ears, these arguments make perfect sense, but at the time, they were less about practicality and more about control. By focusing on her outward appearance, her accusers tried to strip her of moral credibility, to make viewers of the trial believe she must be guilty of something larger. And let's not forget the role of the church here, not as a neutral mediator, but as an active participant in Joan's destruction. It's important to understand that the church was both a religious and a political institution. Many of the men presiding over this trial weren't just concerned about Joan's soul, but also their own positions of power. By standing with the English, they secured more than Joan's condemnation. They solidified their favor with the victorious faction. Throughout the trial, the church's involvement was presented as a legitimate effort to root out heresy. But beneath the surface, it was a game of puppet strings. Joan was the pawn, the English were the players, and the church allowed itself to hold the dagger. After months of questioning, it became clear that the trial wasn't working the way her accusers had hoped. Joan wasn't breaking. The more they pushed, the stronger her responses seemed. Despite being a teenage girl without formal education, she held her own against a panel of some of the most educated men of her time. But her very resilience posed a problem. If she wouldn't confess, she couldn't be convincingly condemned. And so, her trial turned darker. Behind closed doors, they increased the pressure. They threatened her with torture, taking her to the brink of the rack and forcing her to witness the tools that could be used on her body if she didn't cooperate. Despite the horrifying scene laid before her, Joan didn't budge. At no point did she confess to witchcraft, sorcery, or heresy. When it became clear that torture would not yield any additional answers, and might even backfire by making her a sympathetic figure, they abandoned the idea. but their failure to break her spirit only sealed her fate. On May 24th, 1431, the trial escalated to its final act. Joan was tricked into signing a confession claiming she had lied about her visions, a charge she later recanted when she realized the full extent of what she had signed. But it didn't matter. The truth, or lack of it, wasn't the point. Days later, the verdict was delivered. Joan of Arc, the girl who had carried France on her back, had been found guilty of heresy. Her punishment was death by fire. And not just any fire. This was to be a public burning, a spectacle meant to humiliate and terrify. The decision was as symbolic as it was final. By burning Joan as a heretic, the English and their collaborators hoped to erase her legacy, to turn her from a savior into a cautionary tale. But there was a fatal flaw in their plan. For all their efforts to control her narrative, to reduce her to ashes, Joan had become something larger than herself. Her trial couldn't silence her story. It amplified it. People in the courtroom spoke of her composure as the verdict was read. Even condemned, Joan stood firm, praying aloud and refusing to let fear dictate her last moments as the wheel of fate turned ever closer to her end. With the trial over, her enemies had what they wanted, a clear path to extinguish her influence. But what they didn't realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that Joan's story wasn't bound by walls, records, or their warped definition of justice. Her death would be their ultimate weapon, but it would also be the very thing that made her unforgettable. As she prepared to face the flames, the line between heresy and sainthood grew blurrier than ever. All that was left now was fire and faith, and Joan would meet both without bending. Joan of Arc spent her final days in a damp, cold cell, watched constantly by guards who made no attempt to hide their disdain. Though she was surrounded by soldiers and officers, she was utterly alone. The same voices that had guided her through all her triumphs reportedly stayed with her until the end. But how do you stay resolved when death is no longer a distant thought, but something closing in, a date set on the calendar? By this time, Joan's once frozen optimism and defiance had started to thaw. It's said that she asked to see a priest, to make confession and receive the sacraments, small comforts that seemed to be both for her and for the God she still clung to. Her belief might have been as strong as ever, but she was human, and fear, anger, or sadness would have been unavoidable. By this point, even her jailers must have known her end was set in stone. The days of interrogations and theological grilling were behind her. They'd squeezed all they needed from her in a public, exhausting trial that fixed her guilt before her chains had even been clasped. Now she waited, shackled in the dark, preparing for what her enemies had planned, a death they hoped would humiliate her legacy, extinguish her influence, and scare anyone else who dared defy them. But humiliation, as it turns out, is a tricky weapon. It doesn't always work the way you want it to. Early on the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was led out of her cell. Shackles removed, her guards dressed her once again in a simple tunic, men's clothing, a detail her prosecutors constantly used against her. Her hair had been cropped short. How many steps did she take that morning, wondering how history would remember her? To the men surrounding her, she was a condemned heretic, a girl foolish enough to claim God spoke to her. Yet what might she have thought as she caught glimpses of people lining up on the streets, their eyes on her, waiting to see something almost too horrific to process? In Rouen main square, a wooden platform had been constructed for one purpose: to stage her execution as publicly as possible. This wasn't meant to be quick or quiet. It was a spectacle, Hundreds of people crowded into the square that morning, craning their necks to catch sight of her. Townsfolk, curious children, clergy, soldiers. Some came to gawk at the girl who'd claimed she could lead armies. Others, ones who still saw her as God's chosen, must have come with a sick, desperate hope that something might intervene. People who had cheered her on the battlefield were now forced to watch her final defeat. Standing before the pyre, Joan didn't break. Witnesses later wrote about her composure. Words that sound, well, almost impossible. She didn't scream. She didn't fight against her guards. Instead, she asked for a cross. It's said that an English soldier, moved in spite of himself, quickly fashioned one out of 2 small bits of wood and handed it to her. She kissed it, gripping it tightly as if the wood itself would carry her to salvation. Another account stated that one of the clergy members in the crowd provided a proper crucifix, which was held up in front of Joan as the final moments ticked away. What people don't talk about enough is how precise medieval executions were meant to be. Burning at the stake served an important political and social purpose. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance. In an era where public executions were commonplace, these events were highly organized, meant to display the power of the ruling authorities and the ultimate consequence of stepping out of line. For her enemies, burning Joan alive wasn't just about her conviction. They had to send a message loud and clear. Rebel against the established order, and you don't just lose, you're erased. But Joan's execution didn't go entirely according to plan, at least not in the way the English might have hoped. When she ascended the platform, her composure unnerved those who expected tears, terror, or pleas for mercy. She answered her critics not with sobs, but with prayers. As the ropes bound her to the stake, she called on witnesses to remember her innocence and insistently proclaimed her faith. Eyewitnesses described her calling out God's name, shouting Jesus repeatedly as the flames began to rise. Even then, her final instincts were rooted in her belief, rooted in the certainty that her calling had come not from false visions, but from the divine. And while Joan's voice carried over the square, even louder was the sound of the crowd. Public executions were usually a grim form of entertainment. People gathered to jeer, to spit, to gawk at the condemned struggling in their last moments. But at Joan's execution, the atmosphere was strikingly different. Observers, including some of her fiercest critics, recorded an almost hushed dread falling over the crowd. Any cheering or heckling that might have been expected was replaced by stunned silence, murmurs, even sobbing from certain members of the audience. She had been branded a heretic by those with the power to define her. But on that day, standing against the stake, she seemed anything but. The flames were lit, and the pyre began to burn. As the smoke rose higher, obscuring her from view, Joan's final moments lingered in the air. "Jesus," she cried out one last time, the word trembling through the crowd. Smoke, heat, and ash took everything she had known, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the faint crackle of burning wood. Yet even in that, there are stories of something extraordinary. Some witnesses later claimed they saw her heart untouched by the fire, as if a divine sign had been left behind. Whether true or legend, these stories spread, whispered in the same streets that had watched her perish. By the time the show ended, Joan was gone, but her executioners didn't stop there. To ensure no physical trace of her sainthood could emerge, they ordered that her remains, the ashes, and even the fragments of charred wood, be swept up and thrown into the Seine River. What they didn't realize, though, was that her story wasn't something they could toss away so easily. Instead of erasing her, they had immortalized her. In their attempt to destroy her, the English had unwittingly made her a martyr. Her death left the crowd stunned, divided, and unable to forget what they had seen. By all accounts, no one walked away from that square unchanged. Some doubted the charges ever laid upon her. Even members of the clergy present were said to be uneasy, seeing no signs of heresy in how she had faced her end. Medieval audiences were deeply attuned to ideas of martyrdom. Historically, the death of a heretic involved shame, fear, and finality. But Joan's execution had none of these elements. She'd faced her fate not with despair, but with conviction. For every person who doubted the legitimacy of her mission before, there were now questions where there had once been certainty. The most incredible twist in this story isn't that Joan died for her cause, but what came after. Far from silencing her, the flames served as fuel for a growing legend that would only grow stronger over time. People couldn't forget her, not after seeing the way she defied the fire. News of her death spread, first as grim updates, but then as whispers of doubt. Doubt not about Joan, but about the very people who had sentenced her. How could they reconcile the girl they saw praying in the flames with the accusations of witchcraft and heresy that had been leveled against her? For decades after, her story burned even brighter than the pyre ever had. Witness statements taken years later described her not as a heretic, but as someone remarkable, someone who faced her death as only a saint could. In 1456, a retrial led by the church formally overturned Joan's conviction, declaring her trial a sham and recognizing her as innocent of all charges. But by then, Joan had already become a legend. Of course, that's how stories like hers work, isn't it? They don't end at the stake. Instead, they seep into everything that comes after. The battles fought, the histories written, the names whispered in prayers. Joan was silenced, but only briefly. How do you forget someone who walked fearlessly into the flames and left behind a story strong enough to outlast her enemies? You don't. Not really. When Joan of Arc's ashes were scattered in the Seine, those who orchestrated her death likely breathed a sigh of relief. She was gone. The girl who once stood for France's shattered hopes had been erased, or so they assumed. What they failed to realize was that her execution didn't mark the end of her story. If anything, it was the beginning of something much bigger, something they couldn't control. Joan's life, so brief and so turbulent, grew into a legend far larger than the sum of her 19 years. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the reactions were complicated. Many people viewed her as a tragic figure, betrayed by the very forces she had fought to protect. Even among those within the French ranks who had remained silent during her capture, a sense of guilt began to creep in. After all, Joan wasn't just a soldier or a leader. She was widely seen as a divine gift, someone who had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. To stand by and watch her fall into enemy hands, and then to let her die, was a shame that hung heavy over the kingdom. And yet, no one could openly grieve for her, not in any official way. To mourn a condemned heretic was to question the authority of the church itself. A dangerous move in an era where power and faith were deeply intertwined. At the same time, Joan's enemies, the English and their allies, found that silencing her legacy wasn't as easy as silencing her voice. They had intended her death to be a warning, a reminder that rebellion against their rule could only ever lead to destruction. Instead, whispers began to spread, especially among the common folk who had rallied behind her during her brief, meteoric rise. People shared stories of her visions, of her fearless charge into battle, of the way she inspired even hardened soldiers to believe again. For every person who still doubted her, there were just as many who began to question whether the church had made a mistake, or worse, whether they had been complicit in one. This growing unease didn't happen overnight. In fact, the process of reclaiming Joan's story took decades. France itself had to heal first, which was no small feat. It wasn't until 1453, 22 years after Joan's death, that the 100 Years' War finally drew to an end. By then, King Charles VII owed much of his stability and victories in both military and symbolic terms to the foundation Joan had helped lay. With England weakened and driven from French soil, Charles's authority solidified, and along with it came the opportunity to revisit Joan's trial. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was a calculated political move, but Charles ordered an inquiry into her conviction. In 1456, a retrial was held, and this time the tide had shifted in Joan's favour. Witnesses who had been present during her life and trial came forward, sharing accounts of her devotion, her composure, and her acts that had inspired soldiers and civilians alike to see her as something truly extraordinary. The court overturned the original verdict, declaring Joan innocent of all charges and branding her execution a miscarriage of justice, though miscarriage feels like too light a word for what had happened to her. Still, the damage was already done. Joan didn't get to see her name cleared, but to those who believed in her, this was a crucial step forward. It meant that her death wasn't the end of the story. It meant that her memory could finally be reclaimed. Fast forward several centuries, and Joan's legacy continued to grow. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was officially canonized by the Catholic Church. To become a saint isn't a simple process. It requires evidence, testimonies, and most importantly, proof that the life in question exemplified extraordinary virtue. For Joan, the path to sainthood was paved by everything she embodied: courage, faith, selflessness, and a seemingly unshakable conviction that she was doing God's work. The Church, which had once condemned her to the flames, now held her up as a model of Christian virtue. The irony isn't lost here. Joan went from being burned as a heretic to being celebrated as a saint, and while sainthood cemented her place in religious history, her story had already transcended the confines of faith. Joan wasn't just a figure of inspiration for Christians. Her life tapped into something universal, a desire to see courage in the face of impossible odds. Over time, she became a cultural symbol as well as a religious one. Artists painted her, writers reimagined her, leaders invoked her name during times of conflict. Voltaire, Mark Twain, George Bernard Shaw. They all found themselves drawn to her story, reinterpreting her through the lens of their own times and ideas. Twain, in particular, had an obsession with Joan's life. He spent over a decade researching and writing a novel about her, calling her the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced. He wasn't alone in this reverence. Revolutionary France invoked her as a nationalist icon, a unifying figure during turbulent political times. Even in modern France, her name stirs debate and pride, a reminder of both the country's struggles and its resilience. Historians and theologians have spent centuries dissecting her story, trying to separate fact from legend. Some focus on her military strategies, exploring how a teenage girl with no formal training could command armies and win battles that seasoned generals couldn't. Others examine her visions. Were they the product of divine intervention, or of something more psychological, like epilepsy or mental illness? The question lingers, but here's the thing. The how of Joan's story almost doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the effect she had then, and the way her life reverberates now. Today, Joan stands as a reminder of both the power and the peril of conviction. Her story inspires countless interpretations, whether as a feminist icon breaking barriers in a male-dominated world, or as a religious figure whose faith never faltered, or as a human being who refused to let fear stop her from following what she believed to be her truth. Think about that for a moment. How rare it is to find someone so utterly committed to an idea that they're willing to lose everything for it. Family, comfort, even life. That kind of resolve is both daunting and awe-inspiring in equal measure, which is why her life still resonates. A researcher once wrote that Joan's story represents something powerful in the human spirit, the ability to stand up, even when the world tells you to sit down, to raise your voice when everyone else chooses silence. Maybe that's why her name still carries weight today, whether spoken in cathedrals or on fields where battles were once fought. It's not just her victories that people remember. It's her persistence, her refusal to let her circumstances define her purpose. Her legacy spans beyond France now. Around the world, she's remembered as an example of youthful courage, of unshakable belief in the face of betrayal, and of the cost of standing true to yourself, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. Artists still depict her. Schools and organizations bear her name. Historians and writers continue diving into her life, unearthing new ways to understand her role in history. And every time someone reads about her or hears her story, her voice, once silenced in the flames, comes back, a whisper that refuses to fade with time. But perhaps the most significant part of her legacy lies in the question her life leaves behind. At what cost do you follow your convictions? Can one person's faith, unshaken even under the weight of unimaginable odds, truly change the world? Joan believed it could. In the end, it's clear that she was right. Joan's life wasn't just a story of victories or defeats. It was a testament to the power of conviction. She was born into a world that should have silenced her, but instead, she found a way to make her voice echo through history. If you felt even a flicker of something while hearing her story, ask yourself, what voices might you be ignoring in your own life? Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, unwavering. Joan's story isn't just about faith. It's about resilience, sacrifice, and the strength to believe in something greater, even when the odds seem impossible.